Thompson takes on this way of thinking in our culture that we lack a way to rationalize spirituality, so to speak, in the sense that we lack a perspective on deep valuing that we consider rational, that he believes that to take work as this really serious spiritual value is to make it something religious. But in fact, if you approach your work, you know, with a seriousness that it deserves, it's very far from being irrational, and it's very far from being religious. It's actually the opposite. It's very difficult to feel happy and fulfilled if you think that most of what you spend your time doing that would actually improve your life is something that is not morally important, is not deserving of praise, is not something that makes you a good person.
Are you approaching work as a personal value? Is it something that you're pursuing, something you care about? Are you striving to achieve and to keep improving and to like do a good job and achieve things that are meaningful to you and that you really care about and recognize as values? That's the key to satisfaction in your work, much more so than the sort of number of hours or number of dollars. Do Americans have a religious obsession with work? Derek Thompson, a writer for The Atlantic, argues that many do. Thompson's commentary raises important questions about the role of work in human life. And these are questions that are worth contending with. But his analysis equates devoting oneself to work with chasing a dream that few people can ever achieve. Today, we'd like to bring a different perspective to these topics, one informed by Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Our perspective holds that people can find genuine fulfillment in a career if they pursue it not as a duty, but as a personal value. This is New Ideal, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm Sam Weaver, an associate fellow here at ARI, and today I'll be talking with Tristan de Liège, an ARI junior fellow. Hi, Tristan.
Hey, Sam.
So to start off, I wanted to ask you to say a little bit about what Thompson's viewpoint is that we're talking about. Like, what are the issues he's talking about? What's his perspective on these? And why did you think that this was something worth talking about today with our audience?
Yeah, so as you said, Derek Thompson is a journalist. I think he's a good writer, and he's a significant writer. He writes for The Atlantic. He has a significant following. And in a number of articles he's written about work, he's written one called A World Without Work, The Religion of Workism, Why We Have No Time. And in these series of articles where he develops this idea of workism, and what he's doing with that term is it's a neologism. It's a word that he's created, just work plus ism, just to convey the idea that he thinks work is a religion, and or workism is a religion, that we have this obsessive attitude towards work in our culture that's leading to misery and burnout, and that even if a small amount of people benefit from it, for most of us, it's something that's really unhealthy and toxic. And why should we care about it? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that there is a plausibility to the idea that part of what capitalism does is it incentivizes and encourages people to make work very central to their lives. There are many ways to make a lot of money in a capitalist society, and many people adopt a relatively competitive attitude about that. And when you work for a lot of companies, how productive you are is something that is often being measured, and is something that's a measure for yourself, if you think about it that way, as how successful you are in society. And so I think the idea that capitalism motivates us to care a lot about our work and to care about how much money we're making and how far we advance in our careers, from the perspective of like making more money and gaining a certain status, there's a plausibility to that. And I think a lot of people accept that idea in some form or another, and they think of that as something that's bad about capitalism. That's something we could criticize capitalism for, is that instead of allowing us to be content and fulfilled with our lives, is it incentivizes us to strive, to constantly seek for something more in a way that makes us exhausted and burnt out. So the fact that people find that plausible, and then I think Thompson's articles build on that, in an interesting way, is already something that makes it worth thinking about. Like, is that true? Is it something true about capitalism in our current society that it gives us this unhealthy attitude towards work? But the second aspect of it is from like a perspective of thinking that Rand is important, and that objectivism is a philosophy that helps our lives and that makes our lives better, and it says something true about human nature. The fact that she puts work so central to human life and to the meaning and purpose of human life makes it important for us to clarify what that view really means, and to clarify, for example, is it distinct from this common view that people have of capitalism? Is that what Rand is saying? Is that you need to focus on your work to the exclusion of other concerns, or that you need to be really motivated by making money and so on? And to foreshadow of it, we think that there is a significant distinction between how Thompson is characterizing what it means to make work central to your life and how Rand thinks about it. And that's another reason that it's really important to think about this and to clarify it and to care about it. And the last reason is that regardless of which view you come down on, it's true that work is central to our lives, in the sense that we spend a lot of time with it. So the way that you relate to your work is very central to the way you relate to your life as a whole, because so much of our time is spent at work, thinking about work, negotiating with work. And so I think that's why we should care about it. And just to say a bit about the overall idea that Thompson is putting forward in these articles. So he explains workism as the idea that uh, the belief that work is not only necessary to economic production, but that it's also the centerpiece of one's identity and life's purpose. And the belief that any policy to promote human welfare must always encourage more work. And Thompson thinks that this belief or this ideology is a religious belief, in the sense that it's something that people accept in an uncritical way, or as an idea or assumption based on faith, and that also it defies economic logic. So he points out in particular that even though we've become wealthier, we've become more productive with our time, what people have done in contemporary society, particularly in the last few decades, is they tend to work harder and harder and actually care more about making more money, even though what you would economically expect them to do, at least from Thompson's perspective, is use their additional productive power to just buy more leisure time. But instead, people continue to work long hours and we devote ourselves to our work. And it shows that people view work as a means to more work, as a means to doing work at a higher level, or for more money, or for more status, rather than as a means to leisure or as a means to relaxation and enjoyment. And the way Thompson is framing this then is, well, that's an irrational sort of religious attitude that we've had, and it permeates throughout our society. And in spite of the fact that people are more precarious, um, partly because of things like student debt, but also because he thinks there's insufficient protection in our both from being fired and for things like childcare and things that might distract us from our work. And so he thinks that workism has moral and individual implications on how people think about their lives, but also how we think about policy. And that workism has permeated itself through our legal system as well, where we have to make work central to our lives as a matter of law.
Thanks, Tristan. So, just a couple things I want to add to that. One is that I think this whole topic is particularly salient, and I think it's part of why Thompson is writing so much about it. Because of the way that it seems like a lot of people in recent years have been rethinking their relationship with work. I mean, I think the COVID pandemic and the rise of remote work, which are distinct but related phenomena, have, you know, provoked a lot of people to think about the hours that they work, the way that they relate to their work, the way that they relate their time spent on work to their time spent on leisure or hobbies or family, other activities. And there's all sorts of terms and things that people talk about, like quiet quitting or hustle culture, like that these are active topics in the culture. And I think Thompson is coming in with a conceptualization of what he sees as a certain attitude that people have towards work. And I agree with you that this is something that probably comes across as quite plausible to a lot of readers, that there's people. I mean, he points to facts of that apparently people who make a lot of money actually tend to spend more time on work, which he finds sort of counterintuitive. Facts like that, I think people find it plausible that there's some kind of attitude or some kind of religious mentality that's driving their interest in work. And it's worth, I think, getting into what's right and what's wrong about that way of conceptualizing it. Because I think the way that I see it is he's sort of setting up an alternative between workism and like abandoning workism and viewing things in a different way. And I think it's important to like check that and evaluate, is that the right alternative, or is it missing something that is important? And thus, if you frame it as, I'm either going to be a devotee of this religious workism, or I'm going to abandon it and try to minimize the role of work or something like that, are you missing some sort of value in life if you approach it that way? So did you want to add something to that?
No, yeah.
Okay, well, I think we should get more into the issue of his idea that this is a religious mentality. You said a couple of things about this, but I think it's worth pausing on, like, he's seriously comparing this attitude towards work to a religion. And I'm interested in your thoughts on why do you think he calls it that, and do you think that actually makes sense as a way of describing how people think about their work?
Yeah, so the idea of a religion is, of course, an ideology or a set of beliefs that's based on faith. That it's not responsive to evidence. It's not based on reasoning. It's not based on the facts of reality. And I think part of Thompson's motivation for calling it a religion is, as we alluded to a little bit, is that it defies economic logic. And so he thinks there's something irrational about the way we worship work, because what he thinks work is it should be a means to enjoyment, a means to leisure, and a means to things that the rewards that work gives us, not a means to like working more and continuing to work longer hours. The other reason is that he thinks that part of what's happening is there's a myth that's based on something that's partly true or true for a small number of people, which is that he thinks there are some small elite groups. There is a small elite group of people who will have meaningful work and really high paying jobs. And he calls them winners in the workist lottery, people who are busy and but rich, but also deeply fulfilled and can achieve their dreams of self-actualization. But he thinks that when we adopt that as a cultural perspective, a lot of people can't achieve high paying jobs that are meaningful. And so they put too much pressure on themselves to pursue dreams, or in a competitive way in comparison with other people, for example, via social media, that can't actually be fulfilled, that you can't actually achieve, but we keep buying into this dream. And that's part of what I think for him makes it into a kind of religion or a kind of cult, that people are buying into this belief or ideology that actually has nothing to do with how they're actually living and what they can actually achieve. And it's unrealistic to expect everyone to be able to have a job that is both very fulfilling and like makes a lot of money. And I think part of the reason that Thompson thinks that we have this and that this is a kind of religion is that he thinks the actual religion, uh, the actual impact of religion in our culture and uh, dominance of it has declined. And what the workism is really a replacement of traditional religion for a lot of people, in the sense that it gives people a sense of purpose and meaning that formerly would have been given by um, Christianity or Islam, a sense that, you're guided by God or in communication with God or serving God, and that is a source of meaning and spirituality in your life. And in that respect, I think Thompson is right that it's true that in our culture today, we lack secular values that have a spiritual aspect that give people meaning. Um, Often, uh, people view their work as something that isn't spiritually meaningful, right? I mean, people view spirituality or valuing as something that's actually often intrinsically tied to religion. And I think in that respect, Thompson has a point that in our culture today, we lack a way to engage with valuing that allows us to value things that are self-interested, that allows us to value things that are dealing with making money and production. And so we struggle with how to deal with that. But the whole idea of calling, and it's true that religion has declined and that there's a void to fill. But and we'll say more about that, I think, later, because I think a rational philosophy does actually address that. But the whole idea of making work central to your life, being religious, is just totally flawed, because it from the objectivist perspective, part what human nature is and how we survive as human beings is we have to produce the means of our existence. We have to produce the wealth that makes our lives possible and worth living. And um, from that perspective, to make work central to your life is just to be in a rational connection to reality. It's to be in connection with the fact that you are a productive organism, and that to create the things that make your life enjoyable and rich and worth living, you have to work to produce them. They're not just going to come about or be given to you. And that requires thinking, it requires long range planning, it requires uh, orienting your life around that, because it's so fundamental to all of the values that make our life meaningful. And um, and it's a rational perspective in the sense that it requires being sensitive to evidence. It requires thinking deeply about what kind of work you want to do that you're skilled at doing, that can give you the right balance of income and time, that can put you in the right kinds of environments, that you appreciate the right kinds of relationships with other people, that involve solving the kinds of problems you want to solve. And for a lot of people, it takes a lot of experimentation and rational thinking to get to a career that is meaningful to you. So to call it, I think, religious kind of undercuts the whole rational process that goes into selecting and pursuing a career. And I think in part it's because Thompson takes on this way of thinking in our culture that we lack a way to rationalize spirituality, so to speak, in the sense that we lack a perspective on deep valuing that we consider rational, that he believes that take work as this really serious spiritual value is to make it something religious. But in fact, if you approach your work, you know, with a seriousness that it deserves, it's very far from being irrational, and it's very far from being religious. It's actually the opposite. It's a way of connecting yourself to your own nature as a human being, fundamentally.
Yeah, when I was thinking about what Thompson was saying about the religious mentality, the way I'm thinking about it is it's possible that some people have an actually religious mindset about their work. Like if they do work that doesn't mean anything to them personally because they believe that they have some sort of duty to be productive or pursue a certain career, um, and they don't, it's not really connected to their personal values. I don't want to deny that that exists at all, because I think it does, but I don't think that's the dominant phenomenon among people who are really passionate about their work, and it's certainly not the way that it has to be. I think that, Tristan, what you've described is a perspective that people can take to their work, uh, in which it is a genuine source of spiritual meaning and fulfillment, but is not taking it as a sort of mystic kind of command, a belief that they need to act on blindly, or the sort of other things that are conventionally associated with religion and with a religious mindset. Um, I think so. That's an important distinction to make uh, between those two things, and I think also that it's interesting reading Thompson's writings about this, that there's a sense in which he seems to notice that this is the case when he talks about his own experience working. And he the way he writes about it, it sounds like he himself really enjoys his work, is passionate about it, gets a certain sort of source of fulfillment from it. And I don't think he thinks of himself as a religious person or has a sort of religious mindset, but he sort of thinks of himself as a workist in his own way. And it
Right.
part of what that flags to me is there's something that about this conceptualization that is blending together things that aren't really the same, and ought to be distinguished. So I think another topic we should go into is the issue of what Thompson basically says the stakes are, right? I mean, he talks about workism as a problem for most people, the people who don't get lucky and who aren't high achievers in whatever field they're working in. He says that those people, because of their religious devotion to work, they will overwork themselves, they'll become exhausted, they will end up burned out and miserable. And this is like the problem of workism. This is why it's something that's worth, I think, from his perspective, questioning, criticizing, pushing back against. So I'm interested in what your view is of this idea that workism causes misery and burnout, and how you would address like these when they are real problems, because certainly we do know that there are people who are miserable in their careers or do get burned out on their work.
Yeah, so part of again, so for Thompson, and I think a lot of people are sympathetic to this view and this critique of modern um, society and the form of capitalism we have in America now, is that there there's a systematic cultural and also governmental or policy kind of framework that makes us work these long hours and doesn't sufficiently protect us from um, the difficulty of long hours and from the misery and burnout that can happen from making work central to our lives. Um, Obviously, so our view is like it's not the work itself that leads to misery and burnout, but it's clear that some people do have that. Um, and again, we won't go too much into the politics of it, but um, Thompson thinks that the what would prevent the burnout or what causes the burnout is that people's lives are too precarious. So if you had things like universal basic income or greater childcare or shorter amounts of hours that were mandated, perhaps, or like culturally supported as maximum hours per week that people would work, then people would have more time for other things, and then they would be less burned out. But I think, as a matter of fact, it's there are two main reasons that I've seen from personal experience that I understand as philosophical and cultural reasons that people have burnout, and neither of them really have to do with how hard people work. Um, and it's kind of interesting that Thompson puts it to your point of Thompson pointing out that he is an example of what he's talking about, that he's part of the elite that work hard and don't feel burned out. But there are a lot of people that don't make a lot of money that are also not burned out or miserable. So, when you think about like, especially I've met like immigrants that come to America and work incredibly hard, um, and are very inspired and motivated and are not what you would call like particularly rich, especially when they first arrive. But they don't get burned out, and they're certainly not miserable. So I would already like question that whole framing. Um, that there's that kind of association, but I think to point out like the two main problems that I think can lead to misery and burnout. On the one hand, something that I think Thompson doesn't talk about, but he should talk about, and from our perspective is pretty fundamental to a lack of happiness in our culture, is different versions of a duty premise and the prevalence of altruism. And by altruism, we mean, the idea that you have a moral obligation to sacrifice for the sake of others, that self-interest is morally wrong or at best neutral, and that what makes you a good person is not when you do things for yourself, not when you improve your own life, but when you sacrifice things for the sake of others, when you put your own interests aside in order to help other people. And the more you accept that moral framework, and the more that you try to integrate that into your own life and evaluate yourself in that way, it leads to all sorts of problems that I think make people miserable and indeed can make people burned out about their work. And for example, it makes people feel guilty about making more money or wanting to make more money, or more ambivalent about it. It makes people feel guilty about the amount of time they spend at work versus spending with their family, or spending taking care of elderly family members, um, uh, or engaged in leisure. There's this whole idea of like people being workaholics, and that's inherent negative connotation. And again, it's not that there aren't people that are obsessed with work, and it's not that um, there aren't people that focus on their or use work as an escapism for like legitimate obligations that they have. But the whole idea that your work isn't something that's morally important, that's not something that you should congratulate yourself for and celebrate yourself for, and that you know what makes you a good person isn't how well you do your work, but how well you treat other people, how what you sacrifice for other people, and so on, whether it's your family or society, and so on. It's the whole perspective is warped and lacks integration, and it's very difficult to feel happy and fulfilled if you think that most of what you spend your time doing that would actually improve your life is something that is not morally important, is not deserving of praise, is not something that makes you a good person. And the second uh, reason I think that a lot of people get burned out, that Thompson does point out, and I think is right about, but I think he misidentifies the problem, is what Rand calls second-handedness. And Thompson puts it in the form of people comparing themselves to each other, using standards of success that depend on social status, or um, comparing like social impact on social media, or trying to like emulate other people's lives without a first-handed judgment of like why you would want that life, or whether that's really applicable to you or that would make you happy, and just adopting other people's standards and substituting other people's judgment for your own. And it's true that if you adopt the standards of other people, or of society unreflectively, in self-evaluating yourself, and you think about your work through that lens, it's true that that's a recipe for a burnout, because you can always compare yourself to other people in a negative way. You'll never feel fulfilled or good enough, because there will always be um, other people that you can compare yourself less favorably to. And at the end of the day, you'll feel a sort of alienation from your own work, because it and the meaning of it, insofar as your judgment of what's important is not coming from something that you actually believe or that you wholeheartedly value. It's coming from something that you've externally imposed on yourself, that ultimately comes from the judgment of other people. And it's true that if you do that, I think you're much more likely to be miserable and burnt out. But none of those things relate to making work central to your life, because you can make work central to your life without being second-handed, without having a duty premise or an altruistic perspective, and be motivated by love for your work, and be motivated by pursuing your own happiness and your judgment of what you think is important and interesting to do in your work and worth doing. And none of that requires you winning the workist lottery or being um, one of the lucky few. I think that's something that uh, everyone has the possibility to do in like a free modern capitalistic society. So it's not something that you have to make $250,000 a year to live that way. um, you just have to have a first-handed judgment and a rational and integrated perspective of what you're doing, and also have the moral perspective that your happiness is worth pursuing, and that it's good to seek self-improvement through your work.
Yeah, just to bring out a little bit more of what that last point, I think that's a important part of the perspective that we're conveying here, is that it's not so much about the amount of time that you spend on work, or the amount of money that you make, or the title that you reach. It's more about, are you approaching work as a personal value? Is it something that you're pursuing, something you care about? Are you striving to achieve and to keep improving and to like do a good job and achieve things that are meaningful to you and that you really care about and recognize as values. That's that's the key to satisfaction in your work, much more so than these sort of number of hours or number of dollars uh, that you may you may reach. So I think we should talk a little bit more about the objectivist perspective, right? Because we've been sort of talking about it throughout, bringing the perspective of Ayn Rand's philosophy to some of these issues and how Thompson talks about them. But I think we should say a little bit more explicitly about what is the objectivist perspective on the role of work in a person's life, and like what it really looks like to pursue work in a way that actually treats it as an important value and enables you to achieve it. And I want to hear what you have to say about this. And in particular, I think one thing that we should is worth addressing, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, is we've talked about how Thompson sort of thinks that there's this sort of there are these winners of workism who get the fulfilling life, and most people don't get that. And I think we've pushed back against that view. But someone who knows a little bit about Ayn Rand's novels might think, well, most of her characters, or at least the main characters of her novels, are these really elite performers, these like genius architects, steel industrialists, railroad magnates. And does her perspective really work for people who aren't performing at the elite levels of a profession?
Yes, and I think, yeah, to start with that last point, and then going into objectivism's view of work more generally, I think that's right. That it's often attributed to Rand that she has an elitist perspective on human life in general, and that her perspective on work and the meaning of it would just be one form of that. That, her characters tend to be really, especially in Atlas Shrugged, rich, successful industrialists, who are in love with their work and who make a ton of money doing it. And then the question is, why should we, think that our philosophy can apply to everyone? Is that just a philosophy for an elite group of people? Just in the same way that Thompson would argue that workism is something that works for an elite small group of people. I think one point to make is that from the perspective of there being novels, they're dramatic. There are points being dramatized that she wants to make that require her to use characters like that. In part, she's trying to showcase the way in which the lives of people in society depend or benefit so much from the innovativeness and the vision of people who are dedicated to the use of the mind and who do it on a high level. So, and part of what she wants to bring out is that those people like make our lives better, and that society and human life depends on them. But and so partly it's part of how she's dramatizing it. But I think it's also worth noting that even within her novels, there are many instances of her showcasing activities and work that we would regard as relatively ordinary, with a noble character. So, for example, she talks about in The Fountainhead, there's a character, Mike, who's an electrician, and he has exacting standards for his work, and he takes it extremely seriously. Um, and he's portrayed as someone who's morally admirable and has like integrity on that account. There's the character of Eddie Willers, who's the assistant of Dagny, who is an extremely capable and efficacious assistant that loves his work. And he's not portrayed as someone that's elite, or like most people couldn't be like that, or that he's a genius. So I would make that point too, that not even within the novels, it's not really true that it's only about elite individuals. But what about like the broader point of that you were making of what's objectivism's view on work more broadly, and how should we integrate it? And I think what is most important from objectivism's view of work is, again, to tie it back to our previous point, that because work is essential to human nature, what being a productive work, what being rational demands or requires of us is mainly that we apply our own standards in figuring out the kind of life we want to live. And then within the scope of what we're able to do, the ability that we have, figuring out how to bring that about and then actually enacting that consistently. And Rand puts it as, someone who's an objectivist is a disciple of causality. There's someone who their respect is towards reality. And in the case of work, what that means is you don't wish for things that you can't have. You don't substitute other people's judgment for your own. You don't act on unidentified feelings. And in the case of work, what that means is that you know why you're choosing the kind of work you're choosing. You're finding a kind of work that is sustainable for you. And part of what that means is that you care about it and you understand why you're doing it. And I think when you think about it from that perspective, there's a kind of integration that's possible from an objectivist view of work, especially when you think about the fact that there's no moral division between your work and your goodness, as your moral goodness as a human being. That since work is central to your nature, how you approach your work is central to what makes you a good person. And so there's neither is there a conflict between the goals of your work, in the sense that insofar as your goals are to like improve yourself and create wealth and make your life better, that's completely morally valid. But also there's no duty premise or conflict between what you want to do and what you should do. That at least insofar as you're rational, that you're not going to have this inner conflict of, oh, I want to make more money, or this is like the career I really want to do, but that's not what my parents want to do, or that's not what like would be best for helping other people. You don't have those kinds of conflicts because you have an integration between your interests and the goals of your work and how you bring it into your life. And typically I would say like burnout is a sign that something is being undervalued, or that the wrong thing is being valued. So for example, you know, someone might pay insufficient attention to their health or rest, or they're valuing the wrong thing, like they have a lack of clear direction or meaning or self-understanding. Like they're valuing pursuing a career that their parents wanted them to pursue, or on those grounds, or they're valuing how many social media followers you have, or how much money they're making, rather than like, do they actually enjoy what they're doing, and um, do they have enough money to like live the way that they want to. Or there might be other psychological problems, such as a lack of self-esteem, or a lack of a central purpose. Purpose in the sense of like knowing why you're living the way you're living, and knowing that all the way down, and choosing that. And those things aren't related to working hard, or um, you know, like how seriously you take your work doesn't lead by itself to those kinds of problems. And from the perspective of how objectivism can help is, insofar as you value work rationally, it gives you a framework to rationally address those other problems that might happen around your work. So for example, if you're being egoistic about your work and you're not pursuing it as a duty, well, if you think, oh, the way I'm approaching my work is not good for my health. I don't have enough rest. I don't have enough time. Well, like, let me like find a different kind of career that suits my time better, suits my needs better. And I know many people who have, were making a lot of money, who chose a different career path in order to have more time to do other things, um, or other kinds of work, and it made them appreciate their work better. And that's not a way of betraying the idea that work should be central to your life, or it's not making work less central to your life. It's actually an example of making work central to your life, because um, you're taking it seriously and being responsive to the kind of evidence of what you need in order to value your work. And you're not just treating it as a given, as, oh, well, I'm in this job, or I need to make as much money as possible, without questioning why you would need to do that. And because Objectivism has this integrated perspective, it offers you a framework from which you can actually address those kinds of issues and integrate all of the values in your life together.
Yeah, I think that last point, what you're bringing out, is that the perspective on work is, it's part of the full context of your life, and it's an important value, a really important central part of your life, but it needs to be um, consistently or integrated and related to the other aspects of your life, and something that you're trying to build a life that is valuable to you as a whole and in all of the particular elements of it. Um, and I think that's a powerful perspective. And I think, to bring it back, kind of full circle, because we talked about Thompson's view earlier, I think Thompson kind of gives us this alternative of being a workist, a disciple of workism, and being somebody who takes work seriously, but in a kind of duty bound kind of way, or maybe a second handed way, or just you're doing it because you're supposed to do it, or there's nothing else, no other source of meaning, so I guess I'm going to work on this, um, rather than from a perspective of personal value. Or you abandon, reject workism, so that's going to make me miserable, I'm putting that aside. And then I think the implication is you treat work as something that's not an important part, and kind of treat it as a secondary issue. I'm just trying to, like, just going to do as much of it, as little of it as possible, in order to get by. And I think, from the perspective that we're talking about from Objectivism, if you take either of those ways, and if you view it as a choice between those two options, you're missing out on the real value of treating work as a central part of your life, from the perspective of your personal values, and from the perspective of building a life that you want and that you'll enjoy, and that is right for you based on your own choices. So I think we're almost at the end of what we wanted to say. Tristan, do you want to add any other final points on the topic, or if not, take us to the resources that we're going to share with the audience?
Yeah, actually, one more thing that I think really illustrates um, Objectivism's view of work that is really important to think about is, and as a model of how to think about it, um, is when you think about Rourke, uh, he's turning down so many opportunities to achieve like greater social prestige, to like make more money, to get these like incredible commissions, that will drive his career forward. Um, and he's even ultimately to the point where he has to stop being an architect and he has to work in a quarry. And at no point is it viewed as like, oh, you know, either of these things are true, that he's either burning out and he's miserable, and that he thinks of himself as a failure, nor is it the case that he's not making work central to his life. I think it's a really good illustration of what it means to take your work seriously, is that you define what it means for you and you pursue it on your own terms. And that's a completely separate issue from uh, how much money you're making, and um, how prestigious you are, and things like that. And so I highly, and maybe that's a segue too, I highly recommend thinking about that. And in terms of other resources, uh, I brought up Atlas Shrugged as well. I think a lot of what's said about work, particularly what Francisco says about work, um, is really insightful of Rand's view of work. There are also some interesting nonfiction essays that I would recommend where Rand touches on work, or there's secondary literature about Rand. So, in the companion to Ayn Rand, edited by Greg Salmieri and Alan Gotthelf, there's a chapter called The Act of Valuing and the Objectivity of Values that discusses the view of work in the Fountainhead and the meaning of it. I think that's a very useful resource for further thought. Rand's essay, Causality versus Duty, is another essay that brings up partly this idea of like what it means to respect causality, and has a lot of implications for how you think about work. That's in her collection, Philosophy Who Needs It. And then also, I'm doing an Ayn Rand University course on the philosophy of work, and that's about looking at different philosophical perspectives on work throughout history, from the ancient period to today. And yeah, I would recommend looking at that. And those are all recorded, so you can purchase access to that. And yeah, so those are the resources I would recommend for further thinking about objectivism and its view of work.
Great. All right. So, as always, I'd like to say to everyone, if you enjoyed this podcast episode, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to our channel on YouTube. You can always click that bell icon to receive notifications when we go live or publish new videos. We have a lot of great content on the channel, so we hope that you'll subscribe and see more of that. And if you're watching this, we also appreciate if you can like it on YouTube or on Facebook or wherever you're watching it. And if you have thoughts, comment, or share the episode, this will always help us attract new viewers. It helps a lot with the social media algorithms. And that goes whether you're on YouTube or on Facebook or anywhere else. Also, if you have questions or comments about today's episode, or you have ideas for topics that you would like to see us cover on the New Ideal podcast in the future, we'd love to hear from you. And you can reach out to us by email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all of the emails that we receive at that address, and we reply to many of them, so don't hesitate to reach out. All right, that's, I think, all we have for today. So thank you for watching or listening to us, and thanks, Tristan, for this really interesting conversation.
Thanks, Sam.